feeling good? Soaking it in? I know it's a lot. As I mentioned to some of the people here, we had planned about 7 modules, and we're through 1. So a lot of it will be available as a markdown document with step-by-step steps on the Rails Conf tutorials site. So fear not. And we're around all week to answer fun TDD questions. We're both relative newcomers to Ruby and Rails, so we empathize and have a good sense for how beginners get going. So why don't I throw a test in here?
Sounds good.
And then I'll let you make a pass.
So one of the questions we had just before the break there was, how about kind of the sad path, right? Like how are we going to test that validations occur and things of that nature? So instead of doing an integration test, we're going to use a library called shoulda matchers, which is a DSL that can be used in RSpec, a DSL being a domain-specific language. And that'll allow us to write unit tests on these models to make sure that the validations and whatnot are present. So this is in the spirit of letting our tests assert the code we wish we had in our code base, so we won't add the validation to the model until we have a failing test that says that we need it.
Yeah, and so just to describe what I've done here, this file is spec models task underscore spec.rb. So that's some of the convention over configuration. So the spec for the model should be in the models directory and should have the same name, just with underscore spec appended to it. And what I've done here is, this is classic RSpec syntax. I've described the task, so we're pointing to this model, and I'm using shoulda matchers and saying it should validate the presence of the name. Does that look right?
That looks good to me.
So let's see if this fails. So RSpec, what was the flag you're using? FD?
Mm-hmm.
Spec models task spec RB. Great. So this error tells us at the line that we added that shoulda matchers runs a test where it tries to create this element without with something that's blank, with a blank element. So the error says, did not expect errors to include can't be blank when the name is set to nil, and got the error. So this is what we wanted.
And what's happening in the background here is we're setting up the model. We're calling valid question mark on it, and then checking the errors array for that model and looking for can't be blank, which is kind of the standard output you'd see on a web form next to that particular field. So instead of actually going into our integration tests now and checking the contents of the page, we're unit testing the model to make sure that this validation is present. And that'll allow us to kind of not test Rails.
Yeah. When we know, Rails will issue news bulletins when Rails is not working, so we do our best not to test it. So since our test was for a validation and failed nicely in the way that we wanted, Harlow's adding a validation to the model to assert that the task name exists. And he got the test to pass. So can we just see the model again real quick?
Yes.
So what that looks like is this. So within clat, and this, again, the file here is app models task.rb. Thanks. Yeah, this is a great split. So at the top is the model, at the bottom is the test. So validates name, presence true.
And that leads for a nice documentation later, that if someone's wondering what validations are happening on a model, they can look at the unit tests from the spec, and it'll show in plain English what's been set up so far.
Do you mind flipping that back to the code real quick?
Absolutely.
One other point I wanted to make here is a question we get a lot from folks that are new is there are 2 layers of validation in Rails there are what we have here, which is model level validations, and you can add database level validations as well. So when you run your migration, you can do something very similar and say it needs to be present or the database will barf all over whatever you're trying to do. Some ask us if one is better than the other, if you prefer one or the other, and typically we'll do both. So there's a reason for that. When you create, so the model level validations are, the database level validations are impermeable. You can't skip past them in any way. There are ways in which you can get past some of the model level validations. So we like to have both and make sure that our data is clean.
So should matchers has a bunch of assertions that we can make. I just added another one, which is validates uniqueness of name. And then I run that assertion, that fails, and then I can add that up into my,
Multiple assertions. So the question is, can you pass a block with multiple validations? And you can. So there's two ways to do this. Let's get this passing, and then yep. So this passes really nicely. So what we did here was we asserted two validations within one line, within the model on line 2. We said validates name, presence true, uniqueness true. The other way that we could do this is to split those out into 2 lines and just do that twice. You mind just demonstrating that real quick?
So sorry, what do you want to do here?
So just have one validation per line.
Oh, okay.
In the model.
Like 2 describes?
Oh, no. I mean, in the model.
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
Just split that line to the top pane. BIM users may be familiar with the colon W's showing up all over. Yep, and this passes nicely. So I actually prefer this syntax just because it's a little easier to read, but as our participant asked us, yes, you can, for one element, you can add all of the assertions in one line. But to me, each one is an independent idea, and I like how it maps to 2 different matchers in the test file. So I have 2 things here and 2 things there. This was a quick one. Validations are pretty simple, and we can get more excited with them as we go on. But let's just stop there, and let's have some questions. Yes? Right. So the question was, this can begin to look like we're testing that Rails is doing its job properly, which is a great point. I think the way that I see this is less that the validation is working the way that it should, that Rails is making it work. And to me, this asserts that the validation exists. So this is a constraint that I'm putting on the model. And as somebody else starts going through and monkeying with validations, like let's say if I add validates name length must be minimum 20 characters. If in the process of that, I'm drinking a lot of coffee because I live in San Francisco and I've had pour-overs all day, I delete one of these and then I run my test suite, it's going to fail. So that's why we would add assertions for these kinds of validations. But it's a great question. Yep. So the question is, do we really test all the validations all the time? And the answer is yes. And for that reason. So if somebody accidentally deletes one or changes it, then the test will fail and tell us. Yes? So the question was, what about custom validations? So custom validations are a slightly more advanced topic. What that does essentially is you can pass a method name to a validation. So let's say Rails gives us a bunch of these canned validations, that it exists, that it's a number, that it's at least this long, and so forth. If we wanted to make sure that every task had the word kitten in it, so we would write validates, and then we would pass a method name. And the method name might be checks it is a kitten-oriented task or something. And then we would have a method that would be called checks kitten-oriented task, and that would assert that the task name would contain the word kitten and would return a true-false. And you would have a test for that as well.
And there's a convention in Rails. So if you have validate, let's say email as a field, for example, you could go email true, and then this will expect that a file lives in app validators email validator, and we would write unit tests for that validator in spec validators to make sure that we can test the positive and negative cases of what a valid email looks like. I wrote one of these recently. I can absolutely put an example of that up onto the RailsConf tutorial website tonight, too. I think it's super interesting testing your custom validators. So we'll get some example code for that up, too.
Yep. And the test would live in spec validators, email validator spec, .rb. So convention. Yes?
You kind of mentioned removing one of these then makes the test fail, but what's to stop some developer from making a change and going and changing the test?
Nothing. So the question is, the reason for this is to have the test fail if some developer accidentally removes the validation. But what's to stop another developer from removing both the validation and the test for it? And the answer is nothing. Well, the answer is not really nothing. The things that prevent you from being able to do that are the fact that you're programming as a pair, the fact that you have that you give your own code a good once-over beforehand, and that you do code review as a team. Of course, if anybody wants to make any change, you can jam it into master, and there's nothing to prevent it. But we try and create checks, sort of QC level checks along the way before things get merged into master, including really rigorous code review, and that's, I think, where we would try and catch that. But of course, things do sneak past. Good question. Other questions? So we have 5 minutes left. I think that might not be enough time to get going on the next module.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think that's right. So why don't we break a few minutes early? We'll be walking around if we want to answer any more questions.
Any more? No. So we have an announcement. One sec.
We have a coupon code, RailsConf, for 20% off anything on Learn, including first month.
Great. So Chad informs me that we have a coupon code that we use on our Learn portal. Code, and that's good for 20% off everything in the Learn portal, including
Our subscription service, Learn Prime.
our subscription service, Learn Prime. It's 1 month for free.
No, it's 20%
It's
off first month.
20% off the first month, sorry.
And with Learn Prime, we have a series of Ruby on Rails workshops that are recorded. We've written ebooks on Backbone.js. We have an ebook called Ruby Science, which is under development right now. And that really digs into some of these patterns we're talking about in a Rails application. So we have a great culture around kind of continued growth and development of ThoughtBot, and this is something that all of us are putting time into. Our regular.
So just to plug, Harlow's working on Ruby Science, and I'm working on our new version of our playbook.
You want to just touch on the online workshops too? So there's an intro to tester and develop. There's a tester to Rails online workshop that's a month long. Takes place over the course of 4 weeks.
So we'll break now. And I just wanted to say thanks for everybody coming in here. I think it's doing TDD is really difficult, and it takes a lot of hard work and pairing, and I'm glad to see everybody got together and helped each other out. So that was awesome. Made my day. And thanks again for everybody for coming out. We're around all week. If you have questions, pull any of us aside with robots on our shirts, and we're happy to answer questions. And thanks for coming.